Good evening. Thank you, Sister Sharon. I am Dr. Brandy Garlick. I serve as the Associate Dean for Inclusion and Community Standard at this great institution, and I have the esteemed pleasure of introducing our speaker for this evening. I want to thank Sister Mary and Sister Sharon for their willingness to collaborate with me on this lecture. This is a great example of the university embracing diversity. We're thrilled to welcome Mr. Don Kerwin to Notre Dame of Maryland University to speak with us about immigration and refugee issues. Most importantly, what we can do to help our community. Don Kerwin directs the Center for Migration Studies, an educational institute think tank devoted to the study of international migration, to the promotion of understanding between immigrants and receiving communities, and to public policies that safeguard the dignity and rights of migrants, refugees, and newcomers. Mr. Kerwin worked for nearly 17 years at the Catholic Legal Immigration Network, Incorporated, serving as the agency's executive director for 16 years. He has also served as vice president for programs and a non-resident senior fellow at the Migration Policy Institute, an associate fellow at Woodstock Theological Center, and co-director of Woodstock's Theology of Migration Project. He is also on the American Bar Association's Commission on Immigration, the Council on Foreign Relations Immigration Task Force, and on numerous advisory groups. He is also the executive editor of Center for Migration Studies, Journal on Migration and Human Security. He regularly speaks and writes on migration, refugee protection, and related issues. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please join me in a warm welcome to Mr. Don Kerwin.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to Notre Dame to speak with you this evening. I wanted to shout out some thanks in particular to Sister Mary Kerber, who's here, Sister Sharon, who drove us to a beautiful dinner tonight. Thank you. And to Dr. Brandy and to Dr. Mallory Serta as well. And to Professor Mary Lou Yam, who I don't know if she's here, but thank you for having me. So Sister Mary asked me to speak on the U.S. And global migration issues from a religious perspective, and she actually gave me a title. And the title was Embracing Diversity and Immigration and Refugee Issues. See, I have this terrible, it's kind of a condition, I guess, that prevents me from ever coming up with a short title for anything, you know? And so what I did instead was I gave her this long title. I hope this works. And which she then broke into kind of 3 parts. But my title was Welcoming Diversity, a Religious Response to Exclusionary Nationalism, the Crisis in Refugee Protection and U.S. Immigration Policy. That's a real mouthful, I think. So I think we'll stick with the original one, if that's okay. Before I start, let me start with a few numbers. This is a major global issue. As you can see from those numbers, the number of international migrants, that is people that are living outside their country of birth for a period of time, is 244 million. And that number has grown by 41% since the year 2000, so it's a growing phenomenon. And the number of forcibly displaced people by violence or human rights or conflict or whatever is extremely high and at record levels too. And that number, the 65 million number, doesn't count people that are displaced by natural disaster, and some of those are related to climate change, of course. And those numbers are now regarded to be in the 20 millions per year, 25 million per year of people are displaced. You can also see from this the paths to permanent residence in the United States as well. Most enter via family ties. But they also come through employment, as asylum seekers, as refugees, through diversity visas, and through other ways. I wanted to show you this slide because it reveals common ground, I think, among diverse religious traditions on migrants and refugees. I'm mostly going to be speaking, and I mostly know about, the Judeo-Christian view of migrants and refugees. However, needless to say, there's many other religions that have strong, powerful teaching and convictions on this timeless phenomenon as well. And I should add that diverse faith communities in the United States and globally work very cooperatively in the US and elsewhere in advocating for what they view as just refugee and immigration policies. So there's a lot of collaboration and a lot of common understanding of these issues. And finally, by way of preface, I should say that my agency is the Center for Migration Studies. It's a think tank on international migration, as Dr. Brandy said. We do very rigorous policy and research work, but we're also a Catholic agency, and I thought I'd just talk about what that means. It doesn't mean that we idealize immigrants. It does mean that we know and we identify with immigrants and with refugees, that we recognize their gifts, their aspirations, their dreams, and that our work is different than normal think tanks because it's person-centered. And what that means is that we try to build projects and analysis that begins with those at the heart of this phenomenon, and then builds out those projects to their circles of association and their communities. I have brochures on our work up here. If you want to receive our updates or whatever, please come up and I'll give you one, and there's a card inside and we can add you to our distribution list. So there was a very telling exchange. I don't know if you saw this in the press recently. It was between Stephen Bannon, who's the Trump advisor and kind of the Svengali, I guess, and Cardinal Timothy Dolan a couple of weeks ago. And what Bannon did is he very harshly criticized the U.S. bishops' policy positions on immigration, and said that unlike other issues, immigration doesn't implicate church doctrine and religious doctrine. Instead, he said the bishops took these positions to fill their pews and to fill their coffers too. In other words, they were financially self-interested. And in truth, I've got to tell you that the undocumented have not been a financial cash cow for the Catholic Church. And Dolan, of course, the good New Yorker that he is, dismissed Bannon's comments as insulting and preposterous. And he also thanked, and I thought this was meaningful, he thanked Bannon for clarifying that this teaching wasn't in fact a matter of church doctrine, that instead it was a biblical mandate. It came directly from Jesus' mouth by way of the Gospels. And I think that's important because it shows how powerful church teaching is on these issues. Now, in the public square, immigrants are often described as a threat or a problem. But this is not how faith communities view immigrants or refugees. And I thought I'd just jump right to the conclusion. Here's how Pope Francis describes Catholic teaching on migrants and refugees. And it's a really beautiful quote. Let me read it, and I hope you've been reading it too. Every human being is a child of God. He or she bears the image of Christ. We ourselves need to see and then enable others to see that migrants and refugees do not only represent a problem to be solved, but our brothers and sisters to be welcomed, respected, and loved. And he goes on there. Immigrants and refugees are a gift, not a burden. They're not alien to us. They are us. And we see in human persons the face of God. That's it in a nutshell. And I could probably end there and you all could go home, but actually I'm not going to do that. I'm going to talk for another half hour. We're in a very troubling moment in our nation's history, I think, and immigration and refugees are really on the sharp end of it. Immigrant families and communities are in crisis like they haven't been. Persons without legal status and their U.S. families have long been under siege. Politicians have mostly claimed that they support legal immigration, that they oppose illegal migration. That's one of those propositions that sounds great, but it breaks down just as soon as you start to talk about specifics and concrete policies. If you support legal migration and the rule of law, then why are you spending so much time trying to illegalize people and to criminalize people? And why wouldn't you then support those in legalizing their status, those who don't have status? In any event, the point is that more and more legally present persons and legal immigration programs have been targeted in recent months. That, in truth, has always been the goal of anti-immigrant and nativist groups, to limit legal immigration and illegal immigration. But here's what's happened over the last 9 months. The administration has endorsed the RAISE Act. That would slash legal immigration levels in half, and it would particularly target family-based immigration. At a time of record numbers of forcibly displaced persons, it's lowered refugee admissions levels to their lowest level in the program's history. And it also created recently a 90-day pause or a moratorium on resettlement of refugees from 11 nations. These 11 nations happen to be the source of 55% of the refugees that come to the United States. So really what's happening is refugee admissions are being slow-walked. The ceiling is low, and they're not on pace to meet the ceiling. It's eliminated the Deferred Actions for Childhood Arrivals program, also known as DACA, and it's opposed using the most likely legislative vehicle as a substitute for this group to fix the status of these young people. It's announced the termination in 12 months of temporary protected status for Nicaraguans, and it may do the same for El Salvadorans. We'll know in January. Hondurans have been extended for only 6 months, and Haitians are up for a review in later this month. Just yesterday, it terminated the Central American Minors Program, which allowed lawfully present parents in the U.S. to petition for their children in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala to receive refugee interviews, and if they were found to be refugees, to come to the United States legally so they wouldn't have to flee violence there through irregular channels. And it previously terminated another part of that Central American Minors Program. It also wants to expand the expedited removal of asylum seekers caught at the border, or basically people that just present themselves at the border and ask for political asylum. And it wants to allow the indefinite detention of people who can't be removed. The final thing is it plans to deny citizenship or expedited citizenship to legal migrants who have been recruited and entered the military based on skills that are considered to be vital to the national interest. That program is called the MAVNI program, and it may be killed as well. To my mind, that attitude, those measures, they don't make America great. They make it almost unrecognizable. And they also seem to me to reflect a very instrumental rule of the law, not one rooted in the rule of law and its imperatives of protection of human rights and offering adequate process to people. And they don't seem infused with any ethnic of loving one's neighbor either, while I'm at it, or even recognizing that people from certain groups are neighbors. We looked at immigration legislation and presidential signing statements over a 90-year period. And what we were looking for was, is there any consensus on the reasons and the interests served by U.S. immigration and refugee laws? And this is what we found fairly consistently, particularly over the last 50 years. Why do we have these laws? What are the values that guide these laws? Preservation of families, non-discrimination in admission, fairness in process in admission and in removal decisions, providing haven to refugees, which reflect our core history and our commitment to liberty, freedom, and dignity. Economic competitiveness. Immigrants have always been thought to embody self-sufficiency, hard work, and the drive to succeed. They still do. Equality. All U.S. residents deserve access to the benefits of a free and open society. That was Ronald Reagan's statement, actually, when he signed the act that created the last large legalization program in the United States. The rule of law is always an important principle, is reflected in fair, orderly, and secure migration. And then favoring legal migration in opposition to unauthorized migration, which is thought to challenge sovereignty, threaten security, and devalue citizenship. Today, honestly, nativists and restrictionists frame immigration and refugee protection reductively, purely in terms of national security and public safety. Those are the two values that they're talking about constantly. Yet the fact is that immigration is a timeless human phenomenon. It's the world's really its oldest anti-poverty and survival program. It's one that promotes human security. It's one that recognizes the agency of people, and it depends on that. And it's always brought extraordinary benefits to destination and to source countries. There's plenty of room, honestly, for honest debate on U.S. legal immigration and enforcement policies. Plenty of room. Yet I want to call out tonight what I think are arguments that are beyond the pale. And the fact is that anti-immigrant groups in particular regularly denigrate, demean, and libel immigrants. What are some of the tactics that they use? One is what I call the divide and conquer tactic. You profess support for one group, like legal immigrants, although we're attacking legal immigrants too now, but opposition to another group like the unauthorized. But in fact, these groups, if you know immigration law, they're very fluid. People constantly gain and lose status, come in and out of status. Moreover, you typically cannot target one disfavored group without hurting a favored group. Think about, for example, targeting the undocumented parents of U.S. citizen children. You're punishing the children by doing that, right? You're deporting parents from children. The second argument is, I think, scapegoating. That is blaming immigrants for prominent social problems, which in my years of following these issues, they've been blamed for the following: terrorism, the healthcare crisis, mortgage defaults, the Great Recession, high unemployment, displacement of U.S. workers, federal and state budget shortfalls, and even leprosy, believe it or not. I think a related tactic is to libel whole groups by ascribing the offenses of individuals to the broad, vulnerable groups to which they belong, whether it's the undocumented or refugees or whoever. Thus, refugees, for example, become terrorist threats, even though that's the most secure program that we have of admission to this country, is the refugee program. Refugees aren't terrorists. They're victims of terrorists. Terrorists are terrorists, right? It's amazing that you have to say that, but you do in this environment. And it's true also that every single act of refugee protection furthers security, from preventing conflict and terrorism, to working to end refugee-producing conditions, to mitigating the severity of those conditions that drive people to migrate, to supporting the developing nations that host 90% of the world's refugees, to helping resettle refugees in third countries like the United States and to integrate in our societies, and to allowing those refugees who can safely and voluntarily return home to do so. I think Muslims, of course, are now bearing the brunt of similar scapegoating and guilt by association tactics. How does this line of attack work? Let me provide one frivolous and one serious example, and I'll start with the frivolous one. My name's Donald, right? And since I was a child, I can comb my hair for an hour and it'll settle wherever it settles, right? It's always been a struggle for me. Well, let's say that I commit a crime. Would the president, who's another Donald with bad hair, be guilty of my crime? I mean, if not, why not? Because it's not a relevant category, bad hair. Would all Donalds with this painful condition that I have bear the blame for my crime? Or would it be my fault alone? Or a more serious example, I used to speak each year at this journalist conference at the University of Oklahoma. where pro and anti-immigrant groups debated the various issues. We'd debate them in front of journalists. And one year I spent some time and visited the memorial to the victims of the 1995 bombing of the Federal Center in Oklahoma City. This is like a very powerful memorial, as you may know. It was particularly moving, of course, to see the daycare center that used to be there, where it was, where it had been. It was a white man with Irish Catholic roots. I'm a white man with Irish Catholic roots. Does that make me suspect or somehow responsible for the bombing? What does the Christian faith teach about refugees, migrants, and newcomers? It teaches us, at a most basic level, to love God and neighbor, which begs the question, who's our neighbor? This is the very question that a not-so-clever lawyer asked Jesus, and by way of response, Jesus told the story of a traveler who had been robbed, beaten, and left half dead by the side of the road. It's clear from the story that the man left dead, or for dead, is the neighbor. So that's the answer to the question. But it might also be the person walking across a pitiless desert, or a family riding in a crammed, unpiloted boat on the high seas. In any event, the parable is not about who the neighbor is, but it's really about who acts like a neighbor. Who doesn't act like a neighbor is the priest and the Levite. They step out of the injured man's path and show him no mercy at all. Instead, it's the foreigner, the schismatic, the Samaritan, maybe the rough equivalent of today's Mexican unauthorized immigrant or Syrian refugee. Jesus has the Samaritan bind the man's wounds, take him to an inn, and pay for his care. Omar al-Muqtad, a journalist who endured brutal torture as a prisoner of conscience in Syria, has reported on the Syrian civil war and its victims. He's been a neighbor to Syrian refugees in the United States. He's remained a neighbor to those left behind. He's been a good neighbor to his neighbors in the state of Arkansas, which is where he was resettled as a refugee. And now he's a good neighbor in Virginia, where he's my neighbor. We're called to be better neighbors like Omar, and we're also reminded that God chooses unlikely instruments to model compassion and to liberate us. What does the Judeo-Christian tradition say about refugees, migrants, and newcomers? You might read Scripture as kind of the ultimate migration narrative. I do. Father Dan Grudy says that the Jewish people came into being through a migration experience when God called Abraham to leave his homeland and venture forth into new and unknown territory. In Hebrew Scripture, some of the strongest themes involve empathy and identification with refugees and migrants. The Jewish people are taught, "You shall not oppress or afflict a resident alien, for you were once aliens residing in the land of Egypt. You shall not wrong any widow and orphan. If ever you wrong them, and they cry out to me, I will surely listen to their cry." In the Pentateuch, which the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the imperative to love the stranger recurs 36 times. In the New Testament, Christ identifies with the stranger and other dispossessed people. In Scripture, migration in this kind of mysterious way is often, frequently, the occasion and the backdrop of man's experience, or humankind's experience with God, and the encounter with God. If you don't believe me and you read the Bible, try to think of a story that's not about migration in some way. It's not as easy as you might think. Think about the Jewish people's experience of Exodus, dispersion, and exile. Joseph and Mary's trip to Bethlehem, what they carry with them, and what awaits them there. The wise men's trip to the Holy Family and their circuitous route home to avoid persecution by King Herod. Think about the itinerant ministry of Jesus, who's always on the move as he teaches and occasionally flees from hostile authorities. Think about the apostles on the road to Emmaus, or Paul, who's converted on the road to Damascus. After the collapse of the Jerusalem church and the destruction of the temple, the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. the Jewish Christian community migrated in large numbers. And according to the theologian Peter Fahn, the historical record of early Christianity assumes that Christians belong to immigrant communities. The believer is always a temporary resident. The word that's used for believers is paroikos in the Greek. And what that means is a guest, wherever he or she may be. It's also the root word for parish. Migration and flight have been so central to our faith tradition that migration has become our metaphor for our lives on earth. We're moving through life as pilgrims on a spiritual journey to our final home, to the city of God. So given these core teachings, what's the biblical case for what's happening in our country right now, or in our world? For large-scale and indiscriminate deportations, for turning people back at borders, for rejecting refugees, for libeling refugees, for restrictive legal immigration policies. The proof text I always hear, people tell me this, is the one on giving unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. So I decided to read it carefully again, and it was actually the text in church a couple of weeks ago. And this is what happens in that text. The Pharisees and the Herodians, they asked Jesus if it's lawful to pay the census tax to Caesar. They're acting very deferential, as if they want to glean Jesus' wisdom. But in fact, what they're trying to do is to ensnare him, and ensnare him in a way that could lead to his death. The Pharisees believe that paying taxes to the pagan occupying government violates the Torah. If Jesus supports paying this tax, he's going to lose favor with the persons who have just proclaimed him to be king. If he opposes paying the tax, he risks being branded a political criminal and being killed by the Romans. The Herodians are the pro-Rome group. And he ultimately tells both to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. It's confusing in a way because it begs the question, well, what belongs to God and what belongs to Caesar? Well, in the Jewish tradition, everything belonged to God. The people's love, their allegiance, their land, and themselves. Archbishop Charles Chaput of Philadelphia reads this text to mean, we owe civil authority our respect and appropriate obedience, but that obedience is limited to what belongs to God. Caesar is not God, only God is God, and the state is subordinate and accountable to God for its treatment of human persons, all of whom were created by God. As Christians, I think what this means is that we're foremost citizens of the kingdom, not citizens of any particular state. So I think it's fair to ask, in light of this passage, about the immigration debate, do we render unto God by honoring the dignity of migrants, showing them mercy, advocating for them, advocating for their inclusion in our society and their just treatment? Or should we stand back silently and indifferently, honoring Caesar, despite ever harsher and more dysfunctional laws and policies that violate rights, deny process, and target the vulnerable? I recently returned from Los Angeles. In religious terms, integration requires communion between diverse people based on the shared life-giving values that are contained imperfectly in all cultures. We don't see integration as a process of obliterating the culture of newcomers or trying to assimilate them into a fixed dominant culture. In our language, all cultures need to be evangelized, or in common language, improved, strengthened. But culture is also the place where people's deepest beliefs and values can be located. So our vision is one of unity and diversity, and of welcoming diversity. Let me propose a few principles from the Catholic tradition that might be useful in guiding us in thinking about this really contentious issue. First, human beings have a right not to migrate. What that means is they have a right to live fully human lives and to flourish at home. And this is how Pope Benedict put it. I like the quote below too, migration is not a crime, the crime is that which causes migration. It's true. So what happens when people can't survive at home or can't sustain themselves or support their kids or whatever, whether due to poverty or war or persecution or no functional legal system or natural disaster? Well, in those circumstances, they have a right under our tradition to pursue better conditions. Usually they do that by moving internally, but some of them cross borders. And in these circumstances, migration doesn't make them criminals. To our tradition, is God's children, their dignity actually consists in their willingness to give to themselves and to others, to give to others and to give to God. Thus, like when a person flees home, she's exercising her God-given right. And when she uproots her family, when she uproots to support her family, she's acting selflessly, not criminally. Okay? So you can leave to exercise your rights, and you're, in our book, a hero if you're doing that, leaving one's country and leaving one's family to support them. How can we reconcile the right to migrate with the authority of states to regulate migration? Border controls, commonly called. The Mexican bishops and the US bishops took up that issue in a statement that they released in 2003. And what they recognized was the right of a sovereign state to control its borders, but in furtherance of the common good. They also recognized the right of persons to migrate so they could realize their God-given rights. And they concluded with this language: while the sovereign state may impose reasonable limits on immigration, the common good is not served when the basic human rights of the individual are violated. So it's a little bit clumsy, but what they're doing is they're supporting both regulated borders and the protection of the rights of migrants who come to those borders, particularly forced migrants. In fact, they see these two imperatives as complementary. I think that that's a real advance in Catholic social teaching, actually. Integration, the right to migrate creates a corresponding responsibility on behalf of states to receive and to welcome migrants. And St. John the 23rd put it this way: it's that right to enter a political community. You might say that sovereign states have the responsibility to incorporate persons, not to leave them outside the law's protections. That's how I read that passage as well. And immigrants then have a responsibility to contribute to their new communities, which, by the way, they overwhelmingly want to do. That's why they're here. And let me make another obvious point, I think, which is that they have a lot to offer. By and large, they're hardworking, family-oriented, generally optimistic, more optimistic than natives, as it turns out, and they're often rich in faith. They're also exactly the kind of people who can, and in fact, who are revitalizing faith communities throughout the nation. What's different about the immigration debate these days, and I think it really is different, is that you can't speak about immigration anymore without also speaking about national identity. Our nation's identity is contested at this point in ways that it hasn't been, I don't think, in decades. At the extreme, white supremacists, nativists, and ethnocultural nationalists support the domination and the exclusion of minorities, including immigrants. And they feel, and this is a minority, of course, small minority, but they feel vindicated and empowered in ways that they haven't felt in decades. A far larger minority of Americans feel bypassed, ignored, and displaced. A pre-election analysis of Trump supporters found that they were people largely in racially and isolated communities with worse health outcomes, lower social mobility, less social capital, greater reliance on Social Security, and less reliance on capital income. I think it's important to understand and to respond to the problems of these Americans. It's overwhelmingly important to do that. But I also want to make the point that immigrants aren't to blame for those problems, right? They're an easy group to blame, but they're not to blame for them. Moreover, if the U.S. becomes a nation that's defined by race, ethnicity, or other characteristics that people can't change or that they shouldn't have to change, then it will have lost its essential character. It will have lost what makes it a great country. And its immigration policies then will necessarily be exclusionary and shameful. I think, too, that this ideology is on nationalism. I think it's incompatible with the Christian ethic of unifying diverse people around their core beliefs, their core values. And lucky for me, St. John Paul II seems to feel the same way. As he put it, the church considers the problem of illegal migrants, and these are kind of some of the most despised people or the most marginal peoples in our public debates anyway, considers them from the standpoint of Christ, who died to gather together the dispersed children of God, to rehabilitate the marginalized, and to bring close those who are distant in order to integrate all within a communion that's not based on ethnic, cultural, or social membership. Pope Francis has regularly reminded us that building unity across every barrier is central to the Church's mission. You know, fortunately, there's another vision of our nation, and it's the historical vision, I would argue. And this is a very beautiful quote from former President Bush on his inauguration. And it's worth reading. America has never been united by blood or birth or soil. We're bound by ideals that move us beyond our background, lift us above our interests, and teach us what it means to be citizen. So it's about a commitment to ideals and the institutions that uphold those ideals. And, you know, President Washington and President Lincoln and others have enunciated this vision very powerfully as well. Okay, let me speak more directly on immigration and refugee policy and identify some principles that I think faith communities might rely on to guide their thinking on reform of these policies. The first is to address the conditions that give rise to forced migration. States have failed miserably to anticipate, to prevent, to forego, and to effectively respond to conditions like armed conflict, terrorism, and breakdowns in the rule of law. It's predictable when people are going to be forced to migrate. There's all sorts of ways to find that out and to know that, but there needs to be a way to stop it and stop it early. Second, commit generously to robust refugee protection and resettlement policies which benefit refugees who are particularly at risk. You know, there's this argument that's made now that we ought to just fund refugees overseas and not admit any to the United States because it's cost effective to do that. But the fact is that the refugees that come here are the most vulnerable, the most needy, the people that can't survive where they are. It's a different population, actually. UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres has recently highlighted the need to reestablish the integrity of the refugee protection regime. What does this mean? It means that the developing states that host the supermajority of the world's refugees need greater support. They're inadequately supported. In contrast, developed nations do everything they can to keep people from reaching their borders. They try to externalize their borders. They pay others to stop people before they reach the United States. They intercept them, they interdict them, etc. I think strengthening the refugee protection regime also means that there needs to be far greater availability of durable solutions for refugees. And what the traditional durable solutions are only three. People can return safely home, they can resettle in the states that they find themselves, or that they can resettle in third countries like the United States or Europe. Those options aren't available anywhere near the numbers that they need to be, and they're not available to most refugees. In addition, we need to scale up promising alternative strategies that contribute to development in refugee host communities that involve educating refugees, allowing them to work, and allowing them to integrate. A third priority, I think, to reform the U.S. legal immigration is to reform the U.S. legal immigration system, talking about U.S. immigration policy now. Our outdated system does not sufficiently serve the nation's economic, family, and humanitarian interests. I mean, I think everybody knows that. The last time this system has been overhauled is more than 50 years ago. Think about what's changed in 50 years. Normally when people talk about comprehensive immigration reform, which is not really language that we use much anymore, but what they're talking about are three things, three pillars. Reform of the underlying legal immigration laws, the categories of who can come and in what numbers. Legalizing the undocumented, the 11 million undocumented in the United States, and enforcement of the law. Of these three, legal immigration reform is the most important. Legal immigration reform has to include a commitment to reduce the backlog of people who have been approved for family-based visas but haven't received them yet. That backlog is now 4.26 million people. You often hear about the undocumented should get at the back of the line. The fact is they're in the line. They've been in the line, some of them for decades, tentatively approved for visas. It has to also include additional visas for less credentialed workers. Right now, there are only 5,000 visas available per year for so-called unskilled workers. And so the mismatch between our nation's interests and its immigration policies explains in large part the 11 million undocumented population. And it also explains the persistence of migrant crossing deaths. Persons who want to work and whose work is needed often have no legal way to enter. Fourth, we need to create a path to legal status for a high percentage of the U.S. undocumented. I'll discuss that in just a second. Fifth, we need strong but humane immigration enforcement policies. Right now we have very strong enforcement policies. They're very well funded, but they're not always humane. Let me give you a sense of how well they're funded. The two Department of Homeland Security enforcement agencies, their annual budget is now $22 billion a year, and it's rising. And there's a lot more enforcement that's done by other federal agencies, but that's just for two agencies that do this work, $22 billion. That amount is more than we spend on all other federal law enforcement agencies, and all federal and all state labor standards enforcement agencies combined. That's our big law enforcement priority in the United States now is immigration enforcement, not drugs, whatever. Six, we need greater due process for those who are facing removal from our country. 85% of those who are now removed never see the inside of a court and don't have legal counsel, and they're subject to expedited removal processes. Enforcement and due process have to go hand in hand. And seventh, we need to reduce the use of detention. It's the worst feature of our immigration enforcement system. If you want to learn about our immigration enforcement system, go visit an immigrant detention center. You'll be changed by it. This is a brief profile of the U.S. undocumented population, which I hope makes the case for a legalization program and argues, I think, against broad, large-scale, indiscriminate deportations. Who are these 11 million? 4.26 million are family-based immigrants in visa backlogs. Our research has shown that 14%, maybe 15%, it may even be a little bit larger, actually are eligible for some kind of benefit that would put them on a path to permanent residency, which is hard to believe, but they don't know it or they can't afford to pursue it. This raises an imperative, I think, for all of us, which is there needs to be legal screening of undocumented people. There's a legalization program available to us under current laws without Congress acting and without the president and without the courts. 3.5 million of the undocumented have been here for 15 years or more, almost 2 million for 20 years or more. Really, we're going to return those people with all of their equities? I don't think so. 3.9 million are parents of US citizens or lawful permanent residents. You deport them, what happens to their children? And 2.9 million were brought here at age 14 or under. Instead of needed reforms, actually what's happening is we've embarked on a course of mass deportations. And earlier this year, we examined the effect of mass deportation policies from the vantage point of mixed status households. A mixed status household is a household that has an undocumented person in it, which is typically an adult, and it has a citizen in it, which is typically the child of the parent. We found 3.3 million mixed status households in the United States in 2014. These households contain 6.6 million US-born citizens, children. 62% of the undocumented had lived here for 10 years or more. Their median household income was $41,300. The national median is $53,700. And just in general, more than 8 million undocumented people work, and they constitute 5% of the labor force. And of course, they're heavily concentrated in particular industries. Based on this profile, removing undocumented residents from mixed status households would reduce their median income by 47%. It would reduce it to $22,000 a year, which would plunge millions of families into poverty, and it would devastate the communities that they live in. If just 1/3 of the US-born children of undocumented residents remained in the United States after the deportation of a parent, the cost of raising these children, and we used Department of Agriculture numbers on this, the cost of raising these children to maturity would be $118 billion. Who's going to pay for that? I mean, what are the consequences of these policies? Is anybody thinking about them? This is a program that's been in the news a lot over the last couple of weeks. We also did a long report on temporary protected status, and particularly the beneficiaries of temporary protected status, which is called TPS, from El Salvador, Honduras, and Haiti. It's 302,000 people. And TPS is granted to people in the United States who are here on a set date and who come from designated countries that are experiencing conflict, disaster, or other extraordinary conditions that make it unsafe to return. It's been a successful humanitarian program for 27 years. The criticism of it is that it was intended to be a short-term program, but it often leads to long-term presence in the US, which is true. Yet the kinds of conditions, on the other hand, that give rise to a designation of TPS are often not resolved within the initial designation period, which can be anywhere from 6 to 18 months. So there's a lot of people that have looked at this population, and they've highlighted the continued security, public safety, poverty, and infrastructure challenges in places like Honduras, which is an extraordinarily violent country, El Salvador as well. We looked at the potential consequences for the US and for the TPS recipients themselves if they lost this status. And we found that these TPS beneficiaries from these countries, 302,000, they had 273,000 US citizen children. Roughly half of the more than half of the Honduran and Salvadoran TPS recipients had been here for more than 20 years. And for the Haitians, it was more than 16 years. Around 30% of these groups live in households with mortgages, which means they're homeowners. 53,000 potentially qualify for family-based visas based on their relationship to U.S. citizen or permanent residents. And they work at rates that range from 81% to 88%, which is well higher than the rate of the total U.S. population. The single highest number of TPS beneficiaries work in the construction industry. And the second and third highest states are Texas and Florida that are going to require massive reconstruction efforts in the wake of the tropical storms and hurricanes that have just hit them. They can't afford the deportation of legally present residents that are construction workers. So why, again, are we poised to turn these legal immigrants into undocumented immigrants? I think what all of our reports on the undocumented TPS recipients, all of these DACA recipients, all these populations show is how deeply embedded they are in our country. They've been here for long periods, they're working, they have family, etc. Let me begin to end by articulating kind of a religious vision of reform. And also, I'll add a few faith reflections at the end. But here's the vision, or the touchstones. And I hope that it's an empowering vision and it's a hopeful vision as well. Basically, and we've talked about some of these at length, but that all persons, you start with the premise that all people have equal dignity and rights, and everybody has a primary right not to have to migrate. Sovereign states have a right to control their borders, but not at the expense of those who are migrating to realize their God-given rights. Sovereignty itself is not really about denying rights, but about locating responsibility for honoring them. It's not about putting people outside the law, it's about protecting them within the law. It's about advancing human rights. It's about promoting the common good. Rights turn on human dignity. They don't turn on state membership, and they don't turn on immigration status. Not under our Constitution, not under human rights instruments, period. Honoring rights serves the good of everybody, which is government's purpose, serve the common good. The common good speaks to the rights and well-being of everybody, and not just the few or the majority, or only those with immigration status. Different cultures should not be feared, because culture is where people locate their deepest values. It's the only place really where they can locate their values, right? And migration presents an opportunity to unify people then, based on their values. It's that vision of unity and diversity. Father Graziano Battistella, who's a Scalabrini priest who I work with, who runs a center for migrants in the Philippines. He recently wrote that if we recognize the Lord in the migrant, He will recognize us in front of the Father. Powerful. But this recognition, he said, it has to be a public recognition. And it has to be done in a way that liberates the migrant from invisibility and injustice. Pope Francis has repeatedly called indifference the sin of today, or the modern sin. And he's condemned what he calls the globalization of indifference, the pervasive indifference to people in need. And he's called all of us to be artisans of mercy. One of my heroes is Dorothy Day of the who founded the Catholic Worker Movement. And on August 9th, 1936, she wrote to a friend who was disappointed about the impact of her work, and it's very easy to be disappointed these days, and about the seeming indifference of her co-religionists to what she was doing and to what she was seeing. So Dorothy wrote her back, and I think her words resonate today, and let me read them to you. She wrote, "You sounded so discouraged, and you know as well as I do that discouragement is a temptation of the devil. Why should we try to see results? It's enough to keep on in the face of what looks to be defeat. We certainly have enough examples in the lives of the saints to help us, not to speak of that greatest of all failures to the eyes of the world, of Christ on the cross. Why look for a response? After all, we can only do what lies in our power and leave the rest to God, and God will attend to it. As Pope Francis has put it, the cross shows us a different measure of success. Ours is to plant the seeds, and God will see to the fruit of our labors. So what I want to say to you is our brothers and sisters are in crisis. They're in real crisis. It's easy to see. And what we need to do is more than we've ever done, and we need to do it now. We need to do what lies in our power. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Sister Mary Kerber, the Director of Campus Ministry and Service. First of all, we thank you, Mr. Kerwin, for your stimulating presentation, offering a countercultural vision of the present immigration and refugee situation. Besides giving us some rather astounding statistics, you've illuminated the complexity of the immigration issues in the United States and indeed in the whole world. You've called us to a deep dive of exploring the direction and wisdom of faith and its congruence with our core civic values, as well as its power to critique our present response, particularly the call to move from nationalism to communion. So we have about 20 minutes now where we can take some questions for Mr. Kerwin. There will be 2 people in the aisles with microphones. I simply ask you to raise your hands high so they can see you. And who is the first brave soul to begin?
Good evening, sir.
Yeah, hi, sorry.
What drove you to have this passion to work with the immigrants?
I think the main thing is that it changes people's hearts, and it really converts them by the kind of the heroism, the courage, the drive, the self-sacrifice of immigrants. So that's what kind of keeps me in it. Thank you for asking.
You described a lot of interesting points, but what I'm trying to understand is, I teach middle school, and I'd like to know, well, what can I do?
Right. So thank you, because thank you for queuing up that question, because this is what Sister Mary actually asked me to talk about tonight. And I think I don't know that I'm necessarily the expert to tell a school teacher what they can do, because I don't really know what your situation is. But you need to do whatever you can, you know, and help. I mean, know that these kids, if you have immigrant kids in your class, are going through kind of a terrifying time for them right now, particularly kids with undocumented parents who don't know if their parents are going to be back at home when they go back home, you know, and who feel that very powerfully and live with that, and are very traumatized. And it's also true that there's a lot of undocumented people that are getting picked up near schools now. So you have to make sure that that's not happening, and you have to kind of protest that. I think if I was to provide advice on how to become active, what I might say is you ought to be doing advocacy in the United States. There's literally something that happens every week. And agencies like mine, in fact, if you wanted to come up, we tell people what to do every single week, you know, if you wanted to sign up. But there's a lot of other people that do as well. The Jesuit Conference does. The U.S. Bishops' Justice for Immigrants campaign does. You know, any number of, there's interfaith campaigns that do. But make sure you do something every week and what they tell you to do, because that'll be the pressing issue of that week. This week it's temporary protected status. It'll be DACA, you know, next week, whatever. Second, I think also people are abysmally ignorant about what's happening around the globe. And I think that there's a need to become better educated about those issues and to actually champion certain populations, refugee populations. And you can do that through, you know, like an agency like Jesuit Refugee Services. The Rohingya refugees right now, that's an enormous crisis. There needs to be advocacy, there can be advocacy about it. And then I think the most important thing is service and accompaniment. And it's not hard to find what to do when you go to places that are actually doing work and are serving immigrants or are advocating for them. They'll have 15 things for you to do, believe me, you know. Go to invite somebody from Catholic Charities here, invite somebody from an immigrant service agency or whatever, and they will tell you what they need, you know. My agency, it sounds like a lot, but all of us just really operate, a lot of us just on a shoestring, really. And we always have need for kind of people's talents and people's time. So, you know, I think that you can find that in your community or in any community around the country. I also think I would love for this school to adopt a refugee family. I think that'd be very powerful. The Holy Father has actually done that himself and has called for Catholic parishes to do that. And at a time when that refugee program is really under siege, and the funding is being cut, and the numbers coming in are being cut, and the infrastructure is being destroyed, to actually try to lift up that program and to save a refugee family at the same time would, I think, be very powerful. And a lot of parishes are doing that now. So those are some ideas.
This is a loaded question.
Yeah.
What seems to be the biggest challenge that you have in this work that you do?
I mean, I think that the external environment's really difficult, you know. I tell people, we have each other, we have our beliefs, we have our faith traditions, we have our allies, but what we don't have is we don't have the president, and we don't have majorities in either Congress, and we have some states, we have some cities, but we don't have most states. And so I think that the environment is really, really tough right now. And externally, you're dealing with a situation of 65 million forcibly displaced people, and that number is growing every year. And it's going to continue to grow with climate change, I think. So the available permanent solutions for those people are not at all sufficient to address their needs and to make them whole and safe again. And that's a big, big challenge. A lot of people are thinking about it now, but it requires that we all do a lot more than we're doing.
Hello. I have one question. You mentioned that we have a lot of racially isolated communities in which there is a lack of understanding of others. How do you, or what's your vision for spreading the religious touchstones for reform to create a greater understanding and empathy of those refugees or immigrants that we're trying to help and support?
All these are great questions. I think what our religious tradition is all about is being able to identify with other people and to recognize other people as our brothers and sisters, people with the same dreams, the same aspirations, the same beliefs, the same goals. That's it. That's basically it in a nutshell, okay? So I think that a lot of those communities, they don't really know refugees. And we actually looked at where there was very extreme comprehensive anti-immigrant legislation on the state level. And with a couple of outliers like Arizona and Colorado, and there's reasons for that, I think, that we can explain. In most of those places, there weren't that many immigrants. There weren't that many immigrants. It maybe went from 1% of the population to 3% of the population. And what it seemed to be were communities that hadn't seen new immigrants in 100 years or 120 years. And all of a sudden, boom, they saw a population, they saw some growth, and they didn't know what to make of it, you know? But it's all about getting to know other people and understanding them. I do these talks sometimes. Oftentimes sometimes the audiences are more hostile than you guys. We used to go in with dreamers, and we would do our thing. We would always talk before the dreamers did, because however vociferous people were against illegal immigration, just as soon as the dreamers spoke, they would get a rousing standing ovation, because people would understand them, you know, they would know them, they would be rooting for them. That's what it's about. It's about identifying with people. I once did one of these talks, and a lady came up to me afterwards in tears, and she said, you know, I realized who you were talking about. It wasn't about current immigrants. What I realized when you were talking is about my grandparents. That's another way to identify. That is who the immigrants are. They're these people's grandparents or their great-grandparents, but they've forgotten that. So it's all about, anything you can do to get people to identify with immigrants is powerful.
Hey there. Hi, my name is Ashley Vega. I'm actually a religion teacher at Calvert Hall, and I have the joy of teaching everything you just talked about here. I specifically teach a course on Catholic social teaching. So this was really, really great to be here for me. You were getting A in my class.
Thank you.
So a couple things I want to know. First, I'd like to know first where you're, I would assume maybe you have a Christian Catholic background? Yes? What order were you educated by, or were you raised in Catholic school? How did you get this foundation for your faith? That's my first question.
Yeah. We were talking about that over dinner. For me, yes, I was raised Catholic. I didn't go to Catholic schools, but for 2 years I went to DC public schools, and then I went to private schools. And it was an experience of going to church, and there were protesters at that church, and the church was going through a renovation, and the protesters ran homeless ministries and shelters, and they said, well, you're misusing the money. You know, this isn't how Christ would use the money. He'd use the money for the homeless, not to beautify your church. Anyway, I probably don't agree with that anymore in life, but at that time it really struck me. And I found it very powerful, and I started to volunteer with them, and I got into, you know, basically one thing led to the next, and so here I am today, many years later. So that's how I did. But it was actually kind of a really good exposure to radical Christianity, which is powerful, and then following that up with service to people.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
I think you also did a really good job at talking about the sins that we have in our world, stereotypes that seep in really, really quickly. Also, this sin of selfishness, right? This fear of the other and what's going to benefit me. So I think you did a really great job at commenting on that. A couple things. So I want to know, how is this faith-based approach accepted when you go to present at these seminars? So when I'm in my classroom and I'm teaching in a Catholic school, this makes sense. This brothers and sisters talk. This makes sense. But this may not make sense to the person that has no faith background. So if I was someone that didn't have a faith background and you start talking about there are brothers and sisters, I would zone out. So how can you, or how is this accepted? How does your approach, does it seep in? Do people grasp on? Because I think it's a heavy topic if you haven't approached it from this lens.
Yeah, I think most of our work is what you might call totally secular. It's basically hardcore policy work and advocacy and research and writing and speaking, so most of it is not kind of like this. But when there's a religious audience in a Catholic, in a Catholic kind of venue, I do talk a lot about it because I feel that people don't know it. And I feel that it's extraordinarily powerful, and it's a great, both faith, it strengthens your faith, but it also is a great analytical tool that people don't know about. It's like they say about Catholic social teaching, it's the church's best kept secret, you know, which is a huge tragedy, I think. So how do I talk about it? I think what you don't do, and I've learned this through trial and error, a lot of error at first, is you don't go into audiences and you say, okay, I'm going to disabuse you of the myths about immigration right now. We're going to tell you how it is really, and here's the facts and whatever. Anybody will tell you, which I didn't know, is that as soon as you start to disabuse people of the myths that they hold, they buckle down and harden in those myths, you know. They become solidified and they kind of get their backs up. So what you have to do, I think, is that you have to sell them on a vision. And they have to be able to say, yeah, I get it. I like, at least, maybe I don't disagree at the end of the day, but I get where this person's coming from. If it's religion, it's very powerful. But the other way to do it, I think, is through the lens of what kind of country are we trying to build? What kind of communities are we trying to build? Is it the Trump vision? Or is it the Abraham Lincoln vision, and George Washington vision, and Bush vision, and Obama vision? All of whom spoke in the same way about our country. And they say, no, of course not. I'm not a racist. You know, I mean, that's what we use the phrase now, ethno-cultural nationalist. We used to call that racism. That's what we used to call racism. And they buy that. And then you say, okay, and these are the immigrants, you know. These are their aspirations, these are their dreams, these are their families, these are why they came, et cetera, and they get that too. And so it softens them a little bit, and then you can start at that point to talk about, I think, immigration policy and how crazy our immigration system is. And people get that too because they're used to thinking the government is crazy and can't do anything right, you know. And so sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But you start with values, secular values, religious values, whatever, and then you go down from there.
Right, and that's great, I think, to see that even secular or Christian, wherever you're coming from, your values still came line up at one point. And I think, just the last thing I'm going to say, I just love the idea of the encounters you're using, and from personal experience, I love the encounters, right? You love the conversations, you love the stories, you love to hear and, you know, have this compassion to suffer with these people. But I think it also, and I think you get to that, but it also kind of helps us identify, I think, our own sins, right? So coming to terms with our own racisms, even if we may be ignorant to it ourselves. So thanks for coming. This was great, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And I'm gonna give you an A for that question and those comments.
Quick one yet? Very quick.
Just one quick question. As I was listening to you in the beginning, speaking about had the quotes from Islam and from Hindu and Judeo-Christian faith, has there been any talk of bringing all of the leaders from the various religious groups together to form a coalition to address this issue within the United States?
You know, there are such coalitions. There's a big interfaith coalition, and all of the various statements that they've released separately and together are there. And there's a remarkable kind of collaboration and consensus on the kind of values that ought to drive immigration reform. So that's happened. We're actually trying to organize a big event at the UN right now on nationalism that brings together religious leaders from around the world to talk about nationalism as it relates to migrants and refugees. So stay tuned. And please, one thing, when I go places, I don't want to take anything home, so please come up and get these if you would. You know. Thank you.
I'm very sorry to cut off your questions, but Mr. Kerwin has a train to catch. So thank you for those of you that asked questions, those of you that still have them. Maybe they will spur us on to further discussions with each other. First of all, as we wrap up this evening, I'd like to take this opportunity once again to thank you, Mr. Kerwin, for being with us this evening and for helping us to explore the issues of immigration in the United States through the lens of religion and also through the research and work of your Center of Migration in New York. We're grateful to you and to your colleagues for your programs, your work on public policy, and for the many, many research and study efforts that you engage in. Thank you for sharing a wealth of information with us tonight, as well as a treasure of wisdom. Could we please give him another round of applause? I also wish to thank my colleagues, Dr. Sister Sharon Sleer, Dean of the School of Education, many of her students are here, Dr. Brandy Garlick, Associate Dean of the Office of Inclusion and Community Standards, thank you for your collaboration in sponsoring this event. I thank Mallory Serta, Director of Marketing, for her invaluable work in helping to promote this event. I'd also like to thank, you're a great audience. I'd like to thank Erin Gales, my graduate assistant, the Bonner leaders and other students for their service to us before and during this event. Finally, I'd like to thank each of you for the time that you've taken to be here this evening and for our shared participation. I wish you a safe journey home and a blessing on you as you take the action that is tugging at your heart. Have a good night.